My name is Clara Meadows. I was born and raised in the Blue Ridge Mountains, in a small, misty town called Cedar Creek, where the air smells of pine needles and damp earth after a rainstorm. For as long as I can remember, my life has been defined by a sense of deep-rooted stillness, a quiet rhythm set by the changing seasons and the steadfast presence of my grandmother, Maeve. After my parents passed away when I was young, it was Maeve who taught me how to find strength not in noise and ambition, but in the gentle persistence of the world around us, the way a river carves a canyon or a mountain withstands a storm. I carried that lesson with me into my work as a nurse, a profession I chose because it felt like an extension of that quiet care. It was a life I loved, a life I thought I understood. And then there was Leo. Leo Vance was a man who seemed to be carved from a different kind of stone altogether, polished, sharp, and gleaming with the promise of a world far beyond my mountain town. He was an architect, and he spoke of skylines and steel, of futures built from glass and ambition. I was mesmerized. He saw in me, he said, a peaceful harbor, a place of rest from his own relentless drive. And for 5 years, I believed him. We were building a life together, or so I thought. We had a small, sunlit apartment in Asheville, a city that hummed with a gentle energy I'd come to love. Our wedding was 3 weeks away, a simple affair planned for a meadow overlooking the valley where I grew up. Every penny of my savings, every ounce of my hope, was invested in that future. I didn't even get to sit down before he broke it off. The restaurant was one of his choices, all low lighting, hushed tones, and starched white linens. A place designed to make you feel you'd arrived somewhere important. I saw him sitting at our usual corner table, a single glass of amber liquid beside his untouched water. He was staring out the window, his profile sharp and unforgiving against the city lights. "Leo?" I said, my voice soft as I approached. He turned, and the look on his face was not one of welcome. It was distant, clinical, as if he were observing a specimen. "Clara, sit down." My heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I slid into the velvet-upholstered chair opposite him. "Is everything all right? I tried calling you this afternoon." "I was busy," he said, his gaze unwavering. He didn't reach for my hand, didn't offer a smile. He simply took a slow sip of his drink and placed the glass back on the coaster with a deliberate click. "We need to talk." The phrase hung in the air between us, a guillotine poised to fall. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "Okay," I whispered. "What about us?" he said. The word was flat, devoid of the warmth and history it was supposed to carry. "This isn't working, Clara." I stared at him, trying to process the words, to fit them into the reality I had woken up in that morning. "Not working? What do you mean? Is this about the venue deposit?" "I can call them tomorrow." He held up a hand, silencing me. "It's not about the wedding. It's about our lives. Our trajectories. They're no longer aligned." He spoke like he was delivering a quarterly report, every word measured and stripped of emotion. "I've been presented with an opportunity, a significant one. A partnership with Davenport Consolidated." The name meant little to me, but the reverence in his voice told me it was a world away from my quiet life. "Sabrina Davenport and we have a shared vision," he continued, and it was the use of her first name that finally made the ground beneath me crumble. Sabrina Davenport. I'd seen her name in glossy magazines at the salon, heiress to a construction and investment empire that stretched up and down the East Coast. "You're leaving me for her?" The question came out as a breath, fragile and incredulous. "It's not that simple," he said, though his inability to meet my eyes told me it was exactly that simple. "This is about a strategic alignment of our futures. She understands the world I'm moving into. She's a part of it." He leaned forward, his voice dropping as if he were doing me a kindness. "You deserve a simpler life, Clara. A quiet life. The kind you've always known. I was holding you back from that, and you were holding me back from this." I felt a coldness spread through my chest, a hollow ache where my heart had been. He wasn't just breaking up with me, he was rewriting our entire history, recasting me as a provincial creature he had outgrown. Then, as if the cruelty had not yet reached its peak, his eyes flickered down to my left hand. "And the ring," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It was custom designed. The stones were a significant investment. It wouldn't be right for you to keep it. My hand began to tremble. I looked down at the delicate, pear-shaped diamond, the one he had knelt to give me on a sun-drenched hike just a year ago, telling me it was as unique and clear as my spirit. The words felt like ash in my memory now. With numb fingers, I slipped it off. The skin beneath was pale and indented, a ghost of a promise. I placed it gently on the white tablecloth between us. It glittered under the low light, a cold and beautiful lie. "Thank you for your honesty," I said, the words tasting like metal. I didn't know where they came from. Some deep, buried reserve of pride I didn't know I possessed. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and walked away. I didn't look back. I walked past the other diners, their faces a blur of soft-focused contentment. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and into the cool night air. It wasn't until I was 2 blocks away, hidden in the shadows of an old brick building, that the first sob tore its way out of my throat, raw and ragged. I didn't go back to the apartment. I couldn't bear to see our life together disassembled, to see the dress hanging in the closet like a specter. But when I finally forced myself to go the next day, it had already been done. My belongings were packed into neat, labeled boxes stacked by the door. Books. Clothes. The small ceramic bird my grandmother had given me. It was done with an unnerving efficiency that wasn't Leo's style. It must have been his sister, the one who always looked at me with a faint, pitying smile. I was an item being returned, no longer needed. I sat on the floor amidst the cardboard ruins of my life. My lease on my old place had been given up months ago. The wedding had consumed all my savings. A quick check of my bank account revealed a balance of less than $200. Payday was a week away. I was 29 years old, heartbroken, homeless, and utterly humiliated. That's when I did the one thing I hadn't done in years, when I felt truly lost. I called my grandmother. Maeve answered on the second ring, her voice as warm and steady as a hearth fire. "Clara, darling. I was just thinking of you. The lavender is in full bloom. You should see it." I opened my mouth to respond, but all that came out was a strangled sob. That was all it took. She didn't need an explanation. "I'm putting the kettle on," she said softly. "Come home." An hour later, I was on a bus winding its way back into the mountains, leaving the glittering, heartless city behind. I found myself curled on her faded floral sofa, a thick, hand-knit afghan over my legs, cradling a mug of chamomile tea that smelled of honey and forgiveness. She sat beside me, smoothing my hair back from my forehead, just as she had when I was a child with a scraped knee. She didn't press for details. She just let the quiet of her little cottage hold me until the sharp edges of my grief began to soften. "You can stay as long as you need," she murmured, her hand resting on my shoulder. "This house has deep roots, Clara. It knows how to hold a person up. You don't have to be strong here. Just be." That night, I lay in the small guest room under a quilt stitched with 100 different stories, staring at the moonlit patterns on the ceiling. I replayed Leo's words, the cold precision of his dismissal. Had he ever loved me? Or was I just a scenic detour on his road to success, a placeholder until someone like Sabrina Davenport appeared on the horizon? The ache in my chest was no longer just heartbreak, it was a profound and unsettling shame. I had let myself become a footnote in someone else's story. As the first rays of dawn painted the mountain peaks in shades of rose and gold, I made a silent vow. I didn't know how, but I would not let this be the end of my story. I would learn to be my own harbor, my own steadfast mountain. The first 3 days at Maeve's were a blur of deep sleep, long, silent walks in the woods, and the simple, grounding tasks of shelling peas and stacking firewood. I moved through the motions of life, but my mind was a storm of replayed conversations and fractured memories. I told my friends the wedding was postponed, a vague and flimsy lie that tasted bitter on my tongue. The truth felt too heavy to speak aloud. On the 4th morning, while I was helping Maeve weed her sprawling herb garden, my phone buzzed. It was Sarah, my former charge nurse from the hospital in Asheville, a woman whose pragmatism was as sharp as a sterile needle. "Clara? Heard you were taking some time off," she said, her voice brisk. "Everything okay?" "Just some family stuff," I mumbled, plucking a stubborn thistle. "Right. Well, listen, I might have something for you. Might be nothing, but I thought of you. She paused. Remember that agency that recruits for high-end private care? One of my old colleagues just quit a post. Said the money was insane, but the patient was impossible. I stopped weeding, a flicker of interest cutting through the fog of my grief. Impossible how? A recluse. Some tech billionaire who had a bad accident. Paralyzed from the waist down. Lives in some fortress of a house up on the coast of Maine. Apparently, he chews through caregivers like their breath mints. My friend lasted 11 days. Said he was brilliant, bitter, and utterly unbearable. Sounds like a delight, I said, a dry, humorless laugh escaping me. It pays $15,000 a month, Clara. Live in. Private suite. All meals included. No rent, no bills. Just one patient. The number hung in the air, seeming to shimmer with an impossible light. $15,000. It was more than a salary, it was a lifeline. It was a way to rebuild, to stand on my own 2 feet so solidly that no one could ever knock me over again. It was an escape. He sounds like a challenge, I said, my voice firmer now. He's a nightmare, according to Linda. But you were always good with the difficult ones. You have a patience that borders on unnerving. She laughed. And you're stubborn. Maybe you're just what the doctor ordered. Or, in this case, what the monster needs. A strange sense of purpose settled over me. A monster on a remote coast in Maine. It sounded like the end of the world. And right now, the end of the world felt like the perfect place to start over. Do you have a contact? 10 minutes later, I was staring at an email with a name and a number. Ms. Evelyn Reed, estate manager. The instructions were simple. Send a resume and be prepared for a video interview at a moment's notice. I spent the afternoon updating my resume, my hands moving with a purpose I hadn't felt in weeks. That evening, I sat on Maeve's porch, the scent of honeysuckle thick in the twilight air, and dialed the number. A crisp, no-nonsense voice answered on the first ring. Evelyn Reed. Hello, Ms. Reed. My name is Clara Meadows. I was given your contact information regarding a position for a live-in nurse. There was a short pause, the sound of a page turning. Your resume arrived an hour ago. You have 5 years of experience in critical care and rehabilitation. Yes, that's correct. Are you available for an interview tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp? Yes, I am. You will be sent a video conference link. Your references will be checked in the interim. Do not be late. The line went dead. The interview was as brisk and efficient as the phone call. Ms. Reed appeared on my screen, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair pulled into an immaculate chignon and eyes that seemed to assess every flicker of my expression. She asked me 4 pointed questions about my experience with spinal cord injuries, my ability to handle high-stress situations, and my understanding of patient confidentiality. She didn't smile once. Finally, she leaned back, her expression unreadable. The position is yours if you want it, Miss Meadows. The terms are straightforward. 24-hour on-call availability, 2 scheduled days off per month, which must be approved in advance. No personal visitors to the estate. Your medical expertise is paramount, but your discretion is non-negotiable. She paused, her gaze intensifying. Our client is a complex and private individual. You will be provided with a private suite in the West Wing, adjacent to his. Your salary and benefits are as outlined in the contract, which I am sending to you now. I tried to keep my face neutral, to project the calm professionalism she expected, but inside, my heart was soaring. It was real. This impossible opportunity was real. I accept, I said, my voice steady. A contract appeared in my inbox. Sign it and return it by end of day, she said. Your flight to Portland is booked for the day after tomorrow. A car will meet you. Your patient is Mr. Julian Croft. The name meant nothing to me then. Soon, it would come to mean everything. 2 days later, I was in a black car, speeding along a winding coastal highway in Maine. The familiar, rolling green of the Blue Ridge Mountains had been replaced by a landscape of rugged granite cliffs, dark, churning water, and pine trees that clung to the rock, bent and shaped by the relentless wind. The beauty here was not gentle, it was stark, powerful, and a little bit lonely. It suited my mood perfectly. We turned off the main road and onto a long, private drive, passing through an imposing wrought iron gate that swung open silently. And then I saw the house. It wasn't a house, it was a fortress. Named Stonehaven, it was a breathtaking structure of dark stone, sharp angles of glass, and weathered cedar, built directly into the cliffside, overlooking the tumultuous Atlantic. It was magnificent and isolating, a modern masterpiece that seemed to have been born from the storm-tossed sea itself. Ms. Reed met me at the massive front door. She was even more formidable in person, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit. "You're on time," she said, her tone suggesting this was the minimum acceptable standard. "Good. Follow me." She led me through silent, echoing halls. The interior was as stark and beautiful as the exterior, polished concrete floors, vast walls of glass, minimalist furniture. It was less a home and more a museum, curated by someone who valued space and silence above all else. "Your suite is this way," she said, leading me up a floating staircase to the second floor. "Mr. Croft's rooms are at the end of this hall. He is aware of your arrival. You will begin your duties in the morning. For now, settle in." My suite was beautiful, a spacious bedroom, a modern bathroom, and a small sitting area with a window that offered a stunning, vertigo-inducing view of the ocean below. It was more luxurious than any place I had ever lived. But it was also sterile, silent, and deeply impersonal. The next morning, my new uniform, simple black trousers and a gray tunic, laid out for me, I stood outside Julian Croft's door, my heart thudding a nervous rhythm. This was it. The beginning of my new life. The monster in the castle. Ms. Reed stood beside me, a tablet in her hand. "Are you certain you are prepared for this, Miss Meadows?" she asked, her voice a fraction softer than before. "I signed the contract," I replied. "That isn't what I asked." I took a deep breath, the scent of sea salt and clean, cold air filling my lungs. "Yes," I said. "I am." She nodded once, then knocked twice on the heavy wooden door before opening it without waiting for a reply. "Mr. Croft," she announced crisply. "Your new nurse, Clara Meadows, has arrived." The room was immense, with a vaulted ceiling and an entire wall of glass that framed the wild, gray ocean. Sunlight, though pale, streamed in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It felt less like a bedroom and more like an observation deck for a lonely king. He was by the window, his back to us, sitting in a wheelchair that was as sleek and modern as the house itself. He didn't turn. He just sat there, one hand resting on the wheel, staring out at the waves crashing against the rocks below. Finally, after a silence that stretched to the point of discomfort, he pivoted the chair. My breath caught in my throat. I had expected someone older, perhaps frail and withered by his condition. Julian Croft was young, probably in his mid-30s. Even sitting, it was clear he was tall, with broad shoulders and a lean, powerful frame that seemed at odds with his immobility. He had tousled dark hair, a strong jawline shadowed with stubble, and the most intense eyes I had ever seen, the color of a stormy sea, sharp and intelligent, and filled with a profound, weary bitterness. He looked at me not as a person, but as an inconvenience he was already tired of. "So," he said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone laced with cutting sarcasm. "They sent another one." I opened my mouth to introduce myself properly, but he cut me off, his gaze shifting to Ms. Reed. "What's the pool running this time, Evelyn?" "A week?" "2." Ms. Reed's expression remained impassive. "I will leave you two to get acquainted," she said, and with a slight nod in my direction, she exited, closing the door softly behind her, leaving me alone with him. The silence returned, heavy and expectant. "I'm not here to place bets, Mr. Croft," I said finally, my voice clearer and steadier than I felt. "I'm here to do my job." He wheeled his chair a few feet closer, his eyes raking over me in a cold, analytical appraisal. "And what, precisely, do you imagine that job to be? Fluffing my pillows? Offering meaningless platitudes? Administering your medication schedule? Assisting with your physical therapy regimen? Monitoring your vital signs? And supporting your rehabilitation process?" I recited, meeting his gaze without flinching. A humorless smirk touched his lips. You forgot the part where you watch me fail to move a muscle I used to be able to command and then tell me there's always tomorrow. That seems to be a key performance indicator for the others. I'm not here to offer you pity, Mr. Croft. I'm here to offer you professional medical care. He tilted his head, a flicker of something unreadable in his stormy eyes. Well, that's a new tactic. Most of them lead with the sympathy card. It usually takes them 3 days to start crying in the hallway. Maybe I'll surprise you, I said. Maybe, he conceded, though the word was heavy with doubt. He gestured dismissively toward a table. My chart is there. My day starts at 7. Don't be late. With that, he turned his chair back toward the window, a clear dismissal. The first few days were a tightrope walk over a chasm of resentment. I followed his prescribed schedule with quiet efficiency. I was professional, courteous, and unshakably calm, no matter what cynical remark or barbed comment he threw my way. I had cared for soldiers grappling with lost limbs and frightened children battling unseen illnesses. The anger of a man trapped in his own body was something I understood, even if he didn't want me to. I refused to let him see me as fragile. I was his nurse, not his confessor, and certainly not his punching bag. On the evening of the 4th day, as I was preparing his room for the night, he spoke unexpectedly from his place by the window. You're not what I expected. I paused in my task of organizing his medications. How so? You haven't asked about the accident. It was true. The chart detailed the clinical facts, a rock-climbing fall, a severe spinal cord injury, but I hadn't asked for the story. I figured you would tell me if you wanted me to know, I said simply. He was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the distant roar of the ocean. It was in the Alps, he said finally, his voice low and stripped of its usual sarcasm. A solo climb. I was chasing a storm. There was a moment, right at the summit, where I felt completely invincible. Then my anchor gave way. He paused. I woke up in a hospital in Geneva. I haven't felt my legs since. I nodded slowly, letting the silence hold the weight of his words. Thank you for telling me. He turned his chair to face me, his expression searching. Why did you take this job, Clara Meadows? You could work in any top hospital. Why come here, to the middle of nowhere, to care for a broken man? I needed it, I said honestly. Not the money, he pressed, his gaze sharp. Why this job? Why this house? Why this isolation? I met his eyes, and for the first time, I let a sliver of my own brokenness show. Because my future was taken from me without my consent, I said softly. Because I know what it feels like to be discarded. Because I needed to go somewhere so far away that I couldn't be tempted to look back. His expression shifted, the hard lines around his eyes softening for just an instant, a crack in the formidable wall he had built around himself. He turned back to the window, to the vast, indifferent sea. Don't get too comfortable, he muttered, his voice rough again. I don't do gratitude. And I don't do friends. Good, I replied, turning to leave. I don't do illusions. He didn't answer, but as I closed the door behind me, I felt a subtle shift in the air between us. It wasn't acceptance, not yet. But it was, perhaps, the beginning of a truce. It happened on the 5th night. A fierce nor'easter was battering the coast, the wind howling like a mournful spirit against the glass walls of Stonehaven. I couldn't sleep. As I stood by my window, watching the rain lash against the panes, I saw a light on in the East Wing, in the state-of-the-art rehabilitation gym that, according to Ms. Reed, Julian hadn't set foot in for over a year. My first instinct was to ignore it. He was a grown man. But a deeper, professional instinct stirred within me. I slipped on a cardigan over my pajamas and padded silently down the long, dark hallway, the storm outside masking the sound of my footsteps. I pushed the heavy gym door open just a crack and peered inside. The sight that met my eyes made my breath catch in my chest. Julian Croft was standing. He was gripping a set of parallel bars, his arms shaking with the colossal strain, his knuckles white. Sweat beaded on his temples and ran in rivulets down his neck, soaking the collar of his t-shirt. His legs, encased in sleek black braces, trembled violently beneath him. But he was on his feet. And he was moving. Slowly, agonizingly, he was taking a step. And then another. Each movement was a monumental battle against his own body, a testament to a will I hadn't imagined he possessed. He was so deeply focused, lost in his private war, that he didn't notice me at first. But the door creaked softly as I pushed it open a little further, and his head snapped up. His eyes, when they met mine, were not filled with triumph. They were blazing with a raw, cornered fury. "What the hell are you doing in here?" he snarled, his voice a harsh rasp. "I saw the light," I said softly, taking a step into the room. "I thought." "Get out," he commanded, his voice dangerously low. Now. I didn't move. I couldn't. Something inside me had shifted irrevocably. The bitter, cynical man I had been caring for was a facade. Beneath it was this, a man fighting with every fiber of his being, in secret, in the dead of night, to reclaim a piece of himself. He wasn't hopeless. He was hiding his hope, guarding it like a dragon guards its treasure. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why are you keeping this a secret?" His hands tightened on the bars. "Because the second anyone sees a flicker of progress, they expect a miracle," he bit out, his breathing ragged. "They start planning the victory parade. And when the miracle doesn't come, when they realize I'm never going to be the man who climbed that mountain again, they look at me with pity, with disappointment. I've watched it happen. I've seen the light die in their eyes. I won't do it again. So instead, you let them all believe you've given up?" I said, stepping closer, my movements slow and deliberate, as if approaching a wounded animal. "You'd rather they see you as bitter and broken than as someone who is trying and might not succeed?" His jaw clenched. "You don't understand." "Maybe I do," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "Maybe I understand what it's like to feel like your greatest vulnerability is other people's expectations." His furious gaze locked on mine, a storm of anger, shame, and exhaustion swirling within it. "I won't tell anyone, Julian," I said, using his first name for the first time. "But you can't do this alone. This is dangerous. Let me help you. Properly. As your nurse. We can work together on your terms." "Why?" he demanded, his voice cracking with a single, desperate question. "Why would you care?" "Because I was tired of broken things being thrown away. Because I saw in his secret, stubborn fight a reflection of my own. Because I know what it's like to be fighting for a future that no one else can see," I said. He stared at me for a long, breathless moment. The fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a profound weariness. With a shaky exhalation, he slowly, carefully, lowered himself back into his wheelchair. He sat there, breathing heavily, his head bowed. Finally, without looking at me, he muttered one word. "Fine." My heart gave a hopeful leap. "But this stays between us," he added, his voice regaining a sliver of its old command. "No one. Not Evelyn. No one." "I understand. And you follow my lead. When I say we're done for the day, we're done. No arguments." "Agreed." He finally lifted his head and looked at me, his sea storm eyes holding a new, complex light. It wasn't trust, not yet. It was a fragile, conditional truce. "You're not like the others, Clara Meadows." I offered a small, tired smile. "I'm not trying to be." We began the next morning before the sun had risen, before the first staff member had arrived. In the quiet solitude of the gym, we worked. I was no longer just his nurse. I was his silent partner in a clandestine rebellion. Each session was a grueling exercise in pain and perseverance. I learned to read the subtle language of his body, the slight tremor that signaled muscle fatigue, the clenching of his jaw that meant he was pushing past a barrier of pain. I didn't offer empty cheers or praise. I offered steady support, a firm hand on his back, quiet technical corrections, and the silent, unwavering belief that what he was doing mattered. And in the shared silence of those early mornings, surrounded by the scent of antiseptic and sweat, a new foundation was being laid between us, one built not on words, but on shared effort and a secret, burgeoning hope. Weeks turned into a month. The rhythm of our lives settled into two distinct patterns: the public one, where I was the efficient nurse and he was the difficult patient, and the private one, in the pre-dawn hours, where we were allies. The bitterness in Julian's eyes began to recede, replaced by a focused determination. The progress was painstakingly slow, measured in inches, not miles, but it was real. He could stand unassisted for 30 seconds. He could take 3, then 4, shaky steps with the aid of the bars. I was organizing the medical supplies one morning when a voice, unfamiliar and slick with self-assurance, echoed from the Maine living area. "Julian, my friend, you look like hell. But at least it's a very expensive version of hell." Curious, I followed the sound. Lounging on a sprawling white sofa, a crystal tumbler in his hand, was a man in an impeccably tailored suit. He looked to be in his early 40s with a confident, predatory charm. Across from him, Julian offered a tight, polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Marcus. Good to see you too." This was my introduction to Marcus Thorne, Julian's longtime business partner and the man who, Ms. Reed had informed me, was running Croft Innovations in his absence. Something about him set my teeth on edge. It was the way his eyes swept over the room, assessing its value, and the way they landed on me as I entered with a tray of fresh coffee. "And who is this?" Marcus asked, his gaze lingering on me for a fraction too long. "The new recruit?" "This is Clara Meadows, my nurse," Julian said, his voice clipped. "Clara, this is Marcus Thorne." "A pleasure," Marcus said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Let's hope you have a stronger constitution than the last one." Julian can be demanding. "She's not here for your entertainment, Marcus," Julian said coldly. The conversation quickly shifted to business, market shares, investor reports, quarterly projections. I moved about the room, trying to be invisible, but then I heard a name that made me freeze. "Davenport." Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Sabrina Davenport is ready to move. Her father is prepared to inject the capital we need to fast-track the new AI project, but they want a more direct hand in the governance. The paperwork is ready. We just need to transfer the controlling interest in the subsidiary to the holding company. It's a formality." Julian was silent, his gaze fixed on the churning ocean outside the window. His knuckles were white where he gripped the armrest of his chair. "I've already had the lawyers draft everything," Marcus pressed, a note of impatience in his voice. "It's a golden opportunity, Julian. We can't let it slip away. All I need is your signature." "I'll review the documents," Julian said, his voice flat. "You've been saying that for weeks. The Davenports aren't known for their patience." My blood ran cold. Davenport. Sabrina Davenport. The woman Leo had left me for. It couldn't be a coincidence. An investment from Davenport Consolidated. A transfer of controlling interest. Marcus's insistent pressure. A sick, sinking feeling began to coalesce in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't just a business deal. Something was wrong. I slipped out of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. Was it possible? Was I just being paranoid, my personal trauma coloring my perception? Or had I stumbled into the middle of something far more insidious than a simple corporate merger? That night, during our secret session in the gym, I couldn't keep it to myself. As I helped him stretch, my hands steadying his legs, I broke the silence. "Julian, I overheard something today. Between you and Marcus." He didn't look at me, his focus on the stretch. "Go on." I recounted the conversation verbatim, my voice low and urgent. I told him about the pressure, the talk of transferring control, and then, hesitating for only a moment, I told him about Sabrina Davenport. At her name, he paused. "You know her?" The story tumbled out of me, about Leo, about the breakup, about the casual, cruel way I had been discarded for someone with a more advantageous surname. When I finished, the only sound was his quiet, steady breathing. He looked at me then, his expression serious. "Jason Miller. That was his name, your ex-fiancé." I nodded, surprised he'd remembered the name from my file. "I've seen it in emails from Marcus," he said slowly. "He's a junior architect on the new headquarters project. A project largely funded by Davenport Consolidated." The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. It was all connected. My heartbreak wasn't an isolated incident. It was a ripple from a much larger, more calculated event. "Are you suggesting," Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet, "that my oldest friend and business partner is colluding with the family of your ex-fiancé's new lover to take control of my company?" "I'm suggesting it's too much of a coincidence to ignore," I countered. "Marcus thinks you're broken, Julian. He thinks you're too lost in your grief to pay attention. They're counting on you being a passive victim. He didn't reply for a long time, his gaze distant. I held my breath, terrified I had overstepped, that he would retreat back behind his wall of cynicism. Finally, he spoke. "I'll review the documents." That was all he said. For the next 2 days, an impenetrable silence descended. He was distant, lost in thought, and our late-night sessions were cancelled. I was crushed. I had laid my own wounds bare, had risked everything, and he had shut me out. I began to pack a small bag in my mind, convinced I would be dismissed at any moment. On the 3rd morning, there was a sharp knock on my door. It was Julian. He never came to my room. He held a thick file in his lap. "You were right," he said, without preamble. His eyes were clear and sharp, alight with a cold fire I had never seen before. "It's all here, buried under layers of legal jargon. The agreement doesn't just transfer subsidiary control. It triggers a clause that cedes my voting rights on the Maine board to a shell corporation. A shell corporation Marcus established 2 months ago. He's not just getting an investment, he's staging a coup." Relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me dizzy. He looked up at me, his expression a mixture of grim resolve and something I couldn't quite name. "They made a mistake. They underestimated me." He held out the folder. "And they underestimated you. I need your help, Clara. I want you to help me stop them." The study at Stonehaven, once a cold and unused room, became our war room. Every night, after the house had fallen silent, we would meet at the long mahogany table. Under the warm glow of a single lamp, we pored over financial statements, email chains, and legal documents that Julian's loyal attorney, working in secret, had begun to amass. His hands, still learning to obey his commands, would sometimes tremble with exhaustion as he highlighted a critical clause, but his mind was a razor. He was brilliant, moving pieces on a corporate chessboard I could barely comprehend. My role was different. I was his sounding board, his confidant, the keeper of his resolve. I made coffee, I listened, and I reminded him to rest. I watched the man who climbed mountains re-emerge, not on a rock face, but in the lines of a legal brief. "I trusted him," he said one night, staring at a picture on the wall of him and Marcus, years younger, smiling on a sailboat. "He was my best man. He was the brother I never had." "You have a right to be angry," I said softly. "I'm past angry," he replied, his gaze shifting to me. "I'm focused. He thinks I'm still the man who fell. He's about to meet the man who got back up." The plan was audacious. Julian, through his attorney, called for an emergency board meeting. The stated reason was to approve the Davenport deal. Marcus, believing his victory was at hand, readily agreed. The day of the meeting, a different Julian emerged. I helped him into a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit. It was the first time I had seen him in anything other than casual clothes. The man who stood before me, leaning lightly on a simple, elegant cane, was no longer just a patient. He was a commander. "I need to walk in," he said, his jaw set. "They need to see it." We practiced in the long, empty hallway. 10 steps. 20. 30. Each one was a testament to months of secret, agonizing work. When we arrived at the gleaming glass tower of Croft Innovations in downtown Portland, a hush fell over the lobby. Heads turned. Whispers followed us to the elevator. Julian walked beside me, his steps measured and deliberate, his gaze fixed forward. The boardroom was filled with the quiet tension of a high-stakes poker game. Marcus sat at the head of the table, beaming with triumph. Sabrina Davenport was there, poised and coolly elegant. And next to her, looking small and out of his depth, was Leo. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. I saw shock, confusion, and then a flicker of fear in his. I felt nothing, just a distant, clinical pity. When Julian walked into the room, leaning on his cane but undeniably on his own 2 feet, the silence was absolute. Marcus's smile faltered, his face draining of color. "Julian," he stammered. "You're walking." "Not perfectly," Julian replied, his voice calm and resonant in the quiet room. "But well enough." He didn't take his usual seat. He walked directly to the head of the table, placed his hands on it, and looked Marcus directly in the eye. This meeting is now under my authority, and we will not be discussing the Davenport proposal. He slid a thick folder onto the polished table. Instead, we will be discussing breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy, and corporate fraud. One by one, he laid out the evidence. The shell company, the altered contracts, the damning email chains between Marcus and the Davenport's legal team. It was a masterful, brutal dissection of their betrayal. Chaos erupted. Sabrina Davenport stood, her composure finally cracking. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Julian." "Oh, I think I do," he said softly, his voice cutting through the noise. "A man who betrays a friend for money, and a woman who uses her father's name to get what she wants." His gaze flickered for a moment to Leo, a look of pure dismissal, before landing back on Sabrina. Then he turned his head and looked at me, standing quietly by the door. Sabrina sneered. "And what about her? Your nurse? What's her role in all this?" Julian's expression softened as his eyes met mine. "Clara," he said, his voice clear and strong. "She's the reason I'm standing here at all." The board voted. It was swift and unanimous. Marcus was removed, the deal was dead, and the legal repercussions would be severe. As the room emptied, leaving a wake of shattered alliances and ruined ambitions, only Julian and I remained. He was leaning heavily on his cane, his face pale with exhaustion, but his eyes were shining with a triumphant light. "You did it," I whispered. He shook his head, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. "No, Clara," he said, his stormy eyes full of a warmth I had never seen before. "We did." And in that quiet, empty boardroom, I realized that he wasn't the only one who had learned to stand on his own 2 feet that day. In the weeks that followed, Stonehaven transformed. The heavy silence was replaced by the low hum of activity, the murmur of conversations, the occasional sound of Julian's laughter echoing down the hall. The windows were thrown open, letting in the clean, salt-tinged air. It was no longer a fortress, but a home. Our late-night sessions in the gym became early evening walks along the cliff path. His limp was still pronounced, the cane a constant companion, but the bitterness that had once clung to him like a shroud had lifted. Mine had too. The ghost of Leo and the wedding I never had faded into a distant memory, a painful but necessary chapter in a book I was no longer reading. I was starting to see myself not as a woman who had been left, but as a woman who had been set free. We fell into a comfortable rhythm. We had dinner together every night, sometimes cooked by the staff, sometimes a disastrous, but hilarious attempt by Julian himself. We talked about everything and nothing: books, technology, the changing colors of the sea, the future of his company. One evening, as we sat on the terrace watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, he turned to me. "I'm selling the company," he said quietly. I looked at him, surprised. "But you just fought so hard to save it." "I fought to protect it," he corrected gently. "But it represents a life I don't want anymore." The relentless ambition, the man who climbed mountains just to prove he could. He's not who I am now. He paused, his gaze thoughtful. "I'm starting a foundation to fund and develop assistive technologies for people with mobility issues. Something that matters." I smiled. "That sounds like you." "It sounds like us," he said, his eyes meeting mine. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. My heart, which had grown so steady and calm, began to beat a little faster. "Clara," he began, his voice low and earnest. "Before you say anything, just listen. You came into my life when it was in ruins. You saw past the brokenness, past the anger, and you had the courage to show me a strength I had forgotten I possessed. You didn't try to fix me. You helped me learn to fix myself." He opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a simple, elegant ring, a thin band of white gold holding a single, small sapphire the color of a calm sea. "I know I'm still a work in progress," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "And I know you're still on your own journey of healing. I'm not asking you to be my harbor. I'm asking if you'll consider walking this road with me, side by side. Not because we need saving, but because everything is better when I'm with you." Tears welled in my eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or loss. They were tears of a deep, quiet joy, a sense of having arrived at a place I never knew I was searching for. The mountain girl who had felt so lost had found her own sea, vast and full of promise. I looked from the ring to his face, his hopeful, vulnerable, beautiful face. I took the box from his hand, lifted the ring, and slowly slid it onto my finger. It felt right. "I'm not saying yes," I whispered, a smile breaking through my tears. "Not yet." He laughed, a rich, happy sound that was carried away by the sea breeze. "I know. But," I added, my voice growing stronger, "I'm not saying no." He reached across the small space between us and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. He didn't need to say anything else. We had all the time in the world. As the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, we sat in the comfortable twilight, two people who had found in each other not a solution, but a partner. We were not who we were before. And for that, I would be forever grateful. We were the people we had become, together. And that was so much better.